I'm Amir Ariani, Director of Social Data Analytics Lab. Here with me today is Paul Levy from Swinburne Research and Professor Jane Farmer, Director of Social Innovation Research Institute at Swinburne, and James Seymour, CEO of the Center for New Energy Technologies. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar about the C4Net and energy data. This is a third webinar in a series of webinars that marks the launch of the Data Co-op platform. You'll hear from James about the role of C4Net in removing the barrier to access and use of energy data for research. Before I hand over to James, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work together, and Aboriginal and Torres Islanders people participating in this webinar. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal people and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters. We invite your comments and questions. Please look at the Q&A box in the webinar interface. If you think of any questions at any point, please just put it in the box and I will present this to James at the end of the webinar. Alternatively, you can also raise your hand. There's a raise hand button in the interface and I can enable your microphone so you can actually verbally ask the question. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and may be published on our website and social media or on those of our partners. If you do not want your voice to be heard or recorded during the webinar, please email Paul at paullevy@swin.edu.au. We will distribute this recording to you all shortly after the session. Now, at this point, I would like to hand over to James for today's presentation. James, over to you.
Thanks very much, Amir, and thanks for Swinburne for giving us this opportunity, and congratulations on the launch of the Data Co-op platform. What I'm going to do is just give a little bit of background. We've been talking to Swinburne in around ways that C4Net may be involved in the Data Co-op platform and how we can move forward. Swinburne is one of our members. And a very, very strong supporter of C4Net. So it's a nice opportunity just to broaden out a little bit, just what is C4Net, why were we set up, and what are some of the things that we're doing and that may have particular relevance to this, to the data platform. So I will just make sure that will forward on. Paul, we might get you just to go forward a slide, thanks. Okay, so, and we can go forward one more slide. Thank you. So C4Net was formed a couple of years ago by a group of, it was led by the Victorian government, but it was then looked upon by, it's a member platform. And the members that came in were a group of researchers, research institutes of industry, and the policy regulators that came in. So we received a grant from the Victorian government, but really the ongoing support comes from our industry members, which are made up of the electricity distribution businesses here in Victoria. So that's the poles and wires that you see outside that deliver the electricity to your house. And also 6 of the leading research institutes here in Victoria, including Swinburne University of Technology. Now, while we do have that sort of Victorian focus, that's largely around what was the problem that we were trying to address. And one of those problems that we were trying to address was the enormous opportunity that is there, that is provided by the smart meter data here in Victoria. And when I talk smart meter, that's the meter that any Victorians who are on the call now will have attached to the side of their house or their business or their institute, that measures the electricity that comes in and out of their building or of their premise. The idea of C4Net was to somehow try and bridge that divide to make sure that industry was tapping into the the research capability that's here, and also to line up evidence-based policy, to use data to help inform evidence-based policy that drives the real outcomes that we want to see for consumers and businesses, any consumer of electricity. But really, those challenges that are here in Victoria, they're the same as largely what's around the country. So there's nothing in terms of outlook and what we try to address. It's very much a countrywide focus. And some of the I've put in here what we do is the key focus around that simplification of the data access. You know, how do we get the data access so that we can drive the novel use cases? And Paul, if we just go to the next slide, I'll illustrate this a little more. And sorry, I'll illustrate in I'll just give a little bit more background as to what are the changes that are happening in the relevant to the energy sector, and in particular the electricity sector that we look at. And there's mega trends. There are those trends that are acting on our sector that aren't driven by anything here. It's no one company or anything. These are what are happening globally, and we're seeing that as the technology moves on, as the technology advances, in particular around distributed energy resources, think solar, battery, EVs, microgrids. We move very much from the traditional pathway of having electricity generated somewhere over the horizon, brought to us by giant transmission lines, and then distributed down to the end of the line to our premise through the distribution network. Obviously, there's been a massive transition over the last 10 years as distributed energy has taken a much greater role out in the distribution zones. We've seen over $10 billion of assets invested by mums and dads and businesses around in solar type applications. And now we see that there's a whole lot of opportunity within there to build the new grid of the future. And so that transition is going to continue. C4Net's not driving that transition, but we're responding to it. And we're trying to make sure that we can move through that transition as smoothly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And so our scope area is right down on that circular distribution area. But that can be retailers, that can be consumers, that can be behind the meter. It's just not the large scale generation areas that we're looking at in the transmission. We see you've got the evolving consumer preferences. There's a want to be more involved. There's a want to have more control over what is there. There is the data elements where there is big data. The amount of smart meter data that's there, where Victorian houses are being measured at least every 30 minutes now, and that will go to 5 minutes soon. And that's going to be the same around the nation as smart meters roll out more and more. And we've got the policy and regulatory drivers. We know that we've got an energy system that's trying to respond to sustainability, to try and drive to a different mix and to try and adopt the different technologies that are in there. And so if we just jump to the next slide. So the C4Net model is very much about co-creation. It's about not just one-on-one research trying to solve these issues. It's about industry bringing their challenges, their data, the knowledge and skills and insights that they have, matching that with governments trying to think long-term here, the vision that they want to have for the landscape that we'll be operating in over the next decades, and you can see that already in the type of talk of, we hear sustainability, net zero carbon positions out to 2050, for example. If you want to achieve that, you need to start doing things now in order to be able to make sure that you've got the system, the assets in place, and the whole infrastructure. The universities, we know, can bring some incredible insights and new ways of thinking. And that becomes really important mix in there because any industry, any industrial area is always challenged trying to think forward as to what's their next area, where are the solutions of tomorrow, where are the skills that they're going to address those solutions the challenges coming from. And of course, there has to be a consumer and community impact. And so their voice is very strong or needed to be very strong because it's going to really impact them. And that's that C4Net approach that we try to take. if we jump on to the next slide, we'll see where we really try to focus in on. And ultimately, we're trying to help the industry move to the energy market and grid of the future that we seek. And there's 4 key areas then that C4Net addresses. One is around the new energy adoption. So that's the uptake of solar, batteries, new business models and ways of thinking, electric vehicles. While C4Net won't actually promote the individual uptake and everything, what we do is we try to look at what's going to be needed, what's the infrastructure that's needed, and what's the environment, what's the business models, what's the pricing structures and things that are going to be needed in order to facilitate those elements coming into our market. So likewise, the data access and utilization, which I've highlighted here because that's the point of this talk here. Actually, I'll come back to the data access and utilization. The skills development and policy and thought leadership. We know that there's going to be different skill sets required. The traditional engineers that have been in the electricity industry, the traditional business models that have been developed, they're evolving. And we're seeing the need for far more data science to come in, and other skills, community skills, and communication that comes through with that. And then policy and thought leadership. C4Net, we don't represent any individual part of the value chain. We take a distributor through to consumer view, and we try to think through what are the policy settings that provide a balanced approach there, and what would be the evidence that would support those, and then we go and try and build that evidence base for whoever's looking at for whatever their needs are. The data access and utilization is what I'll come back to now, as I mentioned, and that's because we've got a lot of smart meter data, and I'll talk a bit about that later, but how do you access it? How do you utilize it? What are the novel use cases that actually bring forward, that turn data into information? And that's part of what we'll look at with the co-op. And it's quite often, when I talk data, I've spoken so far about smart meter data, but actually we talk about any energy data, energy related data. And that could be Internet of Things. That could be the control of energy type devices that are in the homes, in businesses. It might be even getting into manufacturing and think through manufacturing 4.0, etc., where you've got a highly interconnected and smart system that is optimizing that manufacturing arrangement. That's all energy related data that actually sits in there. And an important point that I'll come to a bit later, especially with the thinking of the co-op, is things like where you combine the energy data with other data sets to actually provide a much richer and deeper information. I won't go through the detail there of projects. I was just giving an illustration. I'm happy to take a follow-on call or questions about it. But we do individual projects with universities and where we facilitate data access, make sure the researchers can access them to try and inform. And I'll come to a few use cases. But we also have a fairly big flagship program that we're developing, and that's around where we utilize not just as any single part of our membership base, but actually the universities come together to try and solve a challenge that is there for the entire industry. And at the moment, that's on the low voltage visualization and the low voltage network, which is, of course, the poles and wires that go past our home, and that's what are going to be hosting many of the new energy elements. Okay, Paul. So through our experience, we've been operating for just over a year. So I'll give you just some insights that we've had already on the barriers to use of energy data as we go to the next slide. The projects that have been put to C4Net, so I gave you the pantheon of the 4 key areas, and just from the proposals that we've actually assessed at the moment, not necessarily that we've gone and supported, but the ones that have come through, you can see that well over 50%, if I look at the yellow and blue, the improved data usage and the access to data have really, so over 50% have been data related. And we looked into what are some of those needs and why is it that the data is hard to access? Because there's a lot of data around, and arguably it's there and available. If we look at what AEMO publish, we look at the NEAR project, and we look at what's available, CSIRO, it's NEAR project, and we look at what's just available as individual consumers and everything, what we can access. It was a little bit of a, what is it? Why can't we actually access it? And so if we just go to the next slide, we'll see that it's all what some observations of what we've had. The build up, but that will they come? There is a lot of data out there, and as I said, the smart meter data in particular, which has consumer elements and network elements that are in there, are available for retailers to provide to their consumers to help to steer them towards new products, to make available their offerings and time of use type considerations, the time of use market offers and everything. But the uptake of it has been very, very low. And why? There's a whole lot of reasons that we can go to. But just because data is available doesn't mean that it's usable, doesn't mean that it's accessible, and doesn't mean that it's interpretable. And that's part of the challenge here that we try to address. We also see a number of initiatives that are out there, and you can see it right now with like the COVID application, the app for your phone. We rarely reward big institutions, and it often takes really big institutions to actually invest in these and to take the risk and to move these types of challenges forward. But we rarely reward them for anything that's less than perfect. And you think of effectively what Facebook gets away with or Snapchat gets away with on something new that they bring to market is slightly less than perfect. And consider that we've had the Solar Vic rollout here in Victoria, and there was a facial application recognition on the application, and that bogged things down for a while. Actually, it was a great app when it worked, and it worked 50 to 60% of the time. And that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. But they got caned for that, and eventually dropped it, which was a pity because it actually had a hell of a lot of benefits that was there. We also have challenges to access and interpret energy data. I frequently have conversations with researchers where they'll just say, well, I'll say, what data is it that you actually want? Oh, I just want all the data. When you say all the data, what data is it? We're talking large volumes of data here. It's not, we have to respect as well that data is not free to access. While it might be free to provide, it might be there. There is a cost in actually going and doing the queries, in doing the cleanups of the data, in making sure that the data actually matches. And I'll illustrate that with one project that we did. There's of course, there's the privacy requirements. There's very, very strict regulations and a lot of sensitivity over energy data in particular. I think probably a bit misplaced, but that's a personal view that sits there. And the reason for that is every reason that gets thrown up, it seems to be fairly hollow. And if we work through them, you can solve. However, the point is the trust is not there. And if you don't have the trust between institutions, then you can't swap that data or to utilize it in a trusted format. And I think that trust is not there, and that's a real barrier that's there at the moment. There's also not that many people are familiar with energy data. And so therefore, you often provide the data and then it's like, well, what's this telling me and how do I interpret it? Well, having an understanding of what's there is important. But there's also a real beauty of energy data here. And what I mean by that is I have young kids and they sometimes, right at primary school age, sometimes energy data is used. And that's because it's actually very tangible to what we can associate it very closely with what we do. We know that when we turn things on in our house, our energy use goes up. It's a great way of building in little bar charts and everything. We also know, like something like solar, we know that in the middle of the day, it's more sunny. We know that at the start of the day, it comes up. Really great way to engage in STEM and everything through energy data. But that can get then you can take those real basics, and there's high school applications, there's TAFE applications, there's tertiary applications as well as in there, and deep academic for trying to identify across the whole power network what's there. So all different levels. And that can sometimes come in then with health type applications as well. And just one that the little infographic here is this is where it's actually it's suburb wide air conditioning that is provided in Singapore. And that's because there's a health benefit, a comfort level and health benefits that come from that, of actually having a cooler environment. This has actually got to the spot where they're even looking at outdoor air conditioning. So you can see it can go quite a way, quite a concept that's there. But this would be thoroughly uneconomic if it wasn't for very smart use of energy data and very smart use of balancing then, almost like it's using energy as a bank. It's using cooling as a bank of energy. And there are times and ways that you can do that then become very economic and enable you to provide something like this. But it's all underpinned by energy data, or you can't do that smartly without energy data. If we just jump to the next slide. So just throwing data at someone when they ask for data is great, but what do you actually do with it? And we've got some challenges here with energy data where there's different parts of the energy data are held by different parties. So there can sometimes be different sources of truth as well. One thing we do have is a very efficient market clearing mechanism and system that is operated by AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator. And they're very strict standards of energy data that provided in that enables an efficient clearing of the market because we, as a consumer, we buy our energy from a retailer. That retailer procures the electricity in the market. They pay for the transmission and distribution from it. They collect that all and wrap it up and provide retail services back to that customer, which is all wrapped up in your bill. But feeding that are some very distinct elements of data that sit there, and they're held by different people, whether it be the distributors, whether it be the retailers, whether it be AEMO. And there's a set of data that sits with the customer themselves. So what happens behind the meter, if I go and do something on it, if I put a battery system in and I choose how I operate that, my retailer and distributor can't necessarily see that, or AEMO can't see that as well. And so that's what we mean by behind the meter. That provides quite a complex environment just at that level. And then think of that goes back through transformers and zone subs and then distribution systems and then transmission systems and back into the wholesale market where everybody's putting the energy in. And AEMO is trying to balance the supply and demand that's in there. The network operators are trying to make sure that the infrastructure can deliver that electricity in a nice stable environment, and the consumer wants to have 24/7, 365-day a year call to as much energy as they want, when they want, and with no forward notification and everything. So there's planning tools and things that actually get in to assess that. Jump to the next slide. So I'll try and illustrate that now just through a few use cases, but it's really then to set up for the questions. So please think of some questions that you'd like me to address through here. Paul, next slide. So one of those is just that we've done recently is a study for the Victorian government actually. And this was on the ability, one of the challenge with a whole lot of solar coming out is that you get solar export. You make more than you need right for that time. And so, but we have other loads around. So it's hard for the networks to balance that export. It raises the voltage. It's very hard to balance. It can be quite localized. We can see troughs in the middle of the day and everything. But we also have sinks around as well. And what we looked at here was actually hot water heating, where there's electric hot water heating. And we looked at the loads. And we found that, you know, the numbers are from memory here, but so there's 8 months of the year when the controlled load, which is the hot water heating, could absorb the vast majority of that solar export. And that's fantastic because it reduces that problem down. If that problem comes down, you can put more and more solar onto the grid in the distributed zones. You can also think of it though that while that hot water heating is there, it can absorb, that's just one means of absorbing energy and storing energy. Electric vehicles are another, the batteries that are associated with electric vehicles, batteries that might be associated to the house, or discretionary loads. And you'll hear people talk about demand response and demand management, where you can actually shift loads during the day. And this sort of but what this did was we went down and looked at 6,000 houses, the individual half-hour data for 6,000 houses over an entire year. So it's quite a bit of data crunching to come up with it. But it came up with, it was really quite insightful what it came up with. Paul, next slide. With we're trying to understand the low voltage network, and I realize this doesn't have a lot of back to the co-op type thing, but to give you an idea of the of the depth of what can be there, with a smart meter attached to every house, the machine learning that can then be applied to that, because you've now got a flow of the data that provides through, we can actually start informing what assets are on which circuit, and that's super important from a hosting capacity point of view, where the distribution networks are sitting there trying to work out how much solar, how much battery, where can electric vehicles charge, when can they charge, is it going to maintain stability, or are we going to have troubles? And being able to do all of that requires a very, very well-informed data set. And they can go out and monitor for that. They can go and send people around and work out where things are, or they can actually do that quite efficiently, it appears, through the mining of the smart meter data, in particular some of the network data that's there. So from a C4Net perspective, that's a really exciting way to go forward. And if we go to the last slide here, thanks. But we've also been working with councils, and I've left this one to just try and bring through some examples that may be thought of here with the co-op. We've both been working with councils and also with the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics has been very interesting in that they are allowed to access individual household data. They only do so under very strict requirements, and not where they go down and identify individuals. But the ability they have is that they can combine with other data sets. So unfortunately, I can't share the results with you, but we have been looking at the type of thing with them with public health responses here in terms of COVID impact, and the likelihood of people to be staying home. Is the message getting through? Not from a compliance area or anything like that, but just as in what are the impacts that are happening and where is the energy moving through the sector? You see, you won't be surprised, consumers are up, industry is down, and the commercial sector is down. But what is it then that which parts of the industry are up? Which parts are really struggling? Who has? How do you match that with other data elements to actually gain insight? And that's an example of what's been done with councils. So if I think of some of the councils really want to report on their greenhouse gas requirements, their usage within their municipalities. So not the buildings, not the council buildings themselves, but the entirety of the municipality. And I've given an example just down here on the left-hand side of this slide, which was a residential cohort within the city of Melbourne. And you can see that these postcodes that were looked at, they have a winter profile. Others have a summer profile, right, where there's air conditioning that's the dominant load. These particular cohorts have a winter profile where they're clearly using electricity for heating or using it more through winter for what their needs are. As we look at matching it though with other data sets, if I look on the right-hand side, which is a study not done by C4Net but by AusNet Services, they actually looked at what was the impact of star ratings that came on houses. So councils have put in a building code or a building requirement. They have introduced a rating for the houses, And you can see the step change that has come in the houses that have been built to those new codes, where they are fundamentally using less power than the houses that were built earlier. It's, again, deep analysis that's down in the smart meter data, but you can do that, and that's available. And so what I just finish off with then is to just think, as we go into matching into health opportunities, there are a number of other indicators that household data could be loaded with. Having the ability to have half-hour interval data for either individual sites or for cohorts of sites gives a level of indication of certain activities that are going on, including self-generation and everything as well. But activities that, you know, for example, when someone's up in the morning, when they actually wake up and start doing things, or if they don't wake up or are late doing things. There are those types of indicators that can be helped. We're aware of a trial over in Spain, for example, where the water authority is monitoring even just flushing of toilets and being able, because they can pick that up. It's quite a distinct signal that's there. And they're using it in some very, very challenged elderly communities where they're actually providing health services. If something hasn't happened by a certain time, there's an intervention that's provided. And it's those types of things that I say, think about, expand your minds and think about where we could go. Thanks, Paul. I'll hand it over back to you now for questions.
Thanks a lot, James. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. So while we are waiting for questions to appear in the interface of Zoom, I have a question for you. You mentioned about the data that's been collected from the smart meters, and I think that is the main true source of the information. So how is the coverage of those across Australia? Like, which areas have the more? What are the rural areas, regional areas? Do we get the right distribution and homogeneous distribution of this technology?
Yeah, it's a good question. So across Australia, AEMO is the body that can answer this perfectly. So this is an imperfect answer. It's somewhere between 10 and outside of Victoria, first of all. It's somewhere between 10 and 20% at the moment, and that's just going up and up. So as meters are replaced, they're replaced by smart meters and interval meters. So the proportion of them is just increasing over time. And a meter may have a smart meter has a lifetime of 10-ish years. Some of the old dial meters can last a lot longer. But as customers are always requested, do they want to go? There's different rules in different places around Australia. So, but all of those meters then report in on the same standard back into AEMO. And so that's the important thing. The standardization is actually very, very high that's in there. In Victoria, I think it's somewhere in 40 to 60,000 premises across the entire state don't have smart meters. So Victoria took a different approach to other states. Victoria mandated the rollout. There are some exceptional circumstances, which is those tens of thousands of sites, but that's it. So well over 2.1 million premises in Victoria have smart meters attached. They have been in place largely since 2013. The rollout was sort of 2009 through 2013. And so therefore there's years of smart meter data now attached to those premises.
I've got a question if you, no one else does. That was great, James, and obviously start to think about potential. So one of the communities that we're working with is a bunch of different services, and I guess in the recent times they've been putting a lot of services online, and one of the things they don't really know is who's able to access these services. So who's got digital access? So a couple of questions around that. One of them is at what sort of granular level you'd be able to use your data, I guess, both technically, but also, you know, ethically or privacy concerns. And then how do community organizations kind of go about navigating those kind of privacy or ethical issues with you guys? Yeah, those are my questions.
Yeah, very good. So what we, first of all, C4Net is not the holder of the data. In Victoria, the metadata providers are the distributors themselves. The distributors will be very, very rigid, as they have to be, to the letter of the law in what they can do. Outside of that, they're really keen to expand as long as their customers are well represented and protected. So it's never contrary to the position of their customers. Then they'll try and maximize the use of the data that is there, and they've been really proactive in that regard. In terms of when it comes down to an individual customer or a couple of customers, their data won't be provided unless there's an explicitly informed consent. So they would need to know. The way that it can be provided is when it is in a de-identified form, and there are actually challenges to re-identification, and it will be under a data use agreement that C4Net facilitates and administers, so that we try to make sure that the data holders here, while there's retailers, distributors, AEMO, in particular, the source that we're using is the distribution businesses. While they hold that data, they're very mindful it's the customer's data, you know, and they're very, very careful about that, and rightfully so. They're also not charged with, you know, what they're rewarded for or what they're remunerated for. They have a service that they have to do, which is the provision of a certain standard of data into the market, into AEMO. They also make it available to the individual customers. Any of us can go and access our data at any time ourselves. Once we're verified we're ourselves, we can go and do that. But we can't provide it to other people without our consent. And so that's why we look at the de-identification and aggregation that's there. And that's why, so that's what the centre does. The centre tries to work with what is the requestor of the data. I spoke about the challenges there in trying to facilitate the data through. And what we found was it was just as much a challenge of the requester being quite succinct in what they needed in order to meet their research requirements, as it was the challenge of the data provider. They don't get remunerated for this, so we try to provide a service there that facilitates that.
Could you actually tell, like, does digital online internet use have particular patterns in data that you could see theoretically?
I'm not quite sure exactly. So the digital, because we don't look at internet use. But we do know, if you mean of how many customers access their data, is that what you mean? It's actually a relatively low percentage, and it might be worth reflecting on just when did you last access your energy data that was there. Personally, I'm the outlier in the conversation usually, but I'm a bit of a data nerd, so that's.
Yeah, I just usually look at the bill, I have to say.
Yeah. So you can go and log on and see every half hour that you want to for the last 2 years just by logging on and seeing. So you have to register to make sure that you're you, but then you can go and do that.
Well, James, I'm just mindful of the time. We are technically over our 40 minutes registration for the webinar, but just to conclude this, I think for the benefit of all the attendees, in the data co-op platform, we are already working with C4Net to basically create a mashup of the energy data with other sources. But these are usually the data co-ops that are run across multiple organizations. So we have the local government partners, we have the PHN partners, we have the industry partner. So that is a very specific use. Now, James, for the individual, because lone researchers who are doing the research and they have a project that they see benefits from the access to energy data, is there any easy way to actually access this information?
So we're happy to help at any time. So the researchers can reach out to us, info@c4net.com.au. just reach out to us, tell us what you're after, and we'll try and steer you in the right direction.
Okay, thanks a lot, James. So Paul, can you take us to the final slide? So, well, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Also, thanks to James and Jane for the discussion. If you have any additional question or if you want to follow up on the access to the C4Net data or the data co-op platform, you can contact James or myself, and the emails are on the screen. Also, you can find more information about the data co-op on the datacoop.com.au. As we go through the upcoming events, so there are some webinars, and also after that, we will also have more activities and announcements related to the energy data. Now, on the webinar part, as I mentioned earlier, this is in the series of webinars. So the next and the final webinar in this series is happening on Thursday at 2 p.m. And that is two presentations from Griffith University on 2 live data co-ops. There would be real life examples of mashing up different informations and leveraging the data layers of data that comes from the public and private sector. So looking forward to see you all in that webinar. And also thanks a lot for attending the webinar today. So have a good day and good afternoon.